it stages a lot of things like the gunfights. They're not stylized, they're not made to look like action scenes. They're very clumsy, which is kind of what you'd expect. Firing those 6 shooters, single action, you cock it every time you fire it. That's a slow process, a hard thing to do in the heat of a gunfight, and they kind of show that. They miss often, duck behind things, fall through doors and stuff to try and get away. It feels fairly authentic, which I think is admirable.
Yeah, because the guns were not super accurate anyway. It works for the film because every shot counts then. So sloppy and stuff's missing. But when they're shooting, you're watching everybody shoot, wondering if they're going to hit their target or if somebody's going to get shot. They're like 10 feet apart at times. Shooting at each other and missing, but I don't know. It works.
No, absolutely. And the one guy I think you can usually be confident he'll hit the target is Doc Holliday, because
The Lord of the Rings had its share of action as well. Believe it or not, it was usually grounded and restrained, apart from Legolas surfing that fucking shield.
Alright, so that was the Pacific. It seems more cinematic, but with Band of Brothers, it had this like grain effect on it to make it seem more gritty. That was done on purpose to kind of give it that vintage look. This one, it seems more clear. So I think Band of Brothers seemed more realistic because it was more grainy, so it looked like it was actually from the time. This looks more realistic in the sense that the images are super clear HD, so it doesn't seem as much as the documentary or something like a feel like that, although it did in the very beginning.
The characters lived in a world of magic, but it was still a world governed by rules just like ours, like gravity and physics, and the limits of human body can realistically survive. Jump off a cliff in Middle-earth, and you're gonna die regardless of the fantastical shit that lives in the world with you.
I was really quiet during this movie. I think it happens more with films that are more down to earth. Lately I've been reacting to like sci-fi and fantasy, which is like action-packed. It's just like a lot to react to. But with a movie like this, where it's just zoned in and you get to see what their life is like, I love that so much.
When characters were put in dangerous situations in Lord of the Rings, you actually felt tension, because for the most part, they were given realistic limitations, and when they exceeded those limits, you can conjure up the most fantastical worlds, but you still have to set rules to abide by and stick to them. Break them too bad or too often, and your audience will disengage because there's nothing left to believe in.
This movie reminded me how much I do love real life getting captured in a movie. Sci-fi and fantasy, they're very high highs and very low lows because of that element of anything can happen, but there's still this level of comfort within it where it feels not real. You know, it's just so beyond imagination. It's cool to see stuff like that come to life in movies, but it's also, there's a subconscious thing in my head when I'm watching sci-fi and fantasy. I'm very aware that I'm watching a movie.
This is why realism is so important. This is why I'm making these videos, to emphasize its importance. When dealing with sci-fi and fantasy, for some people, it is so easy to get taken out of the movie if it isn't believable. And that's why it's so important that it is as realistic as possible a lot of the times, to keep you engaged and immersed in that world so that it is believable. You can have all the fancy explosions and things you want, but it has to make sense. Otherwise, it'll suck me right out of the movie and right out of my seat, and I'm going home. Funny thing about fantasy is a lot of times you don't actually want to do the thing that you're fantasizing about. My fantasy is war, but I don't want to go to war. That's horrific. But it's exhilarating to be that close to it, as close as possible, without actually being there. Hence the watching a war movie or being a superhero. It's all fun and games to imagine that, but to actually be a superhero is a whole nother thing, and it does take courage and sacrifice and such. The reality is, a lot of the times we engage in fantasies that we would never want to do in real life, and that's why we would never want to do it in real life. So it's fun where you can pretend you're somebody you would never really want to be, but it's fun to step into another person's shoes, into another role. But the point remains, generally you do not want in real life to have your fantasy come true.
And have a movie this week be centered on what could very well be a real life situation. It makes the highs and lows scary in a much different way than sci-fi or fantasy could ever do to me, because it just feels so real. I guess I should say too, like, the acting in this film was perfect. And Leonardo DiCaprio in a role of someone who has a disability. To me, I'm not sure if I've been around somebody who has that disorder to know if he played it well, but to me it seemed like he played it really well. It didn't feel not believable at any point. Watching it back, knowing this is Leonardo DiCaprio, and to not be distracted in any way by the actor and not think about that at all and just be absorbed right into Arnie. There wasn't even a point where I was like, he acted really good in that scene. I didn't even think that. I was just so into the scenes and into the story.